Have you ever known someone who went missing or was murdered? What happened? My mom is a part-time nanny and watches kids from time to time. Recently she was watching a 2-year-old baby boy from since when he was a newborn. One day his mom picked him up after work from our house, claiming that she was receiving messages from angels sent from God and hearing voices in her head. My parents were reluctant to let her leave with her son, but she insisted that everything was okay and she was going to go talk to someone about it. The next day she never dropped off the baby boy at our house or answered her phone, so my dad got worried and drove over to her condo. The cops had taped off the entire neighborhood and were not letting anyone into her condos. We found out about an hour later that she had stabbed her baby to death and lit a fire in her condo in the middle of the night. It was absolutely devastating in our community as well. My family was heartbroken. The woman I went to church and later university with as a kid. I maybe talked to her casually in passing. She was a few years older than me and our social circles did not overlap. But she was always kind of a golden child. Sang in the choir, graduated with good grades and went on to medical school. She moved away to a new state to start her training as a psychiatrist, but went mysteriously missing after a few months. Her disappearance spread rapidly on social media because she was so universally liked. Then weird stuff started coming out of the woodwork. Her ex-husband came forward and said that she always struggled with mental health and it was one of the things that led to their breakup. The famous gospel singer claimed that she had been stalking him for years through phone calls, social media videos referring to herself as his wife, had written him hundreds of letters and had even contacted his children. This had led him to file a restraining order against her. The surveillance video surfaced of her attempting to check into a hotel several miles away from where she worked, offering cash and then being erratic when they wouldn't accept it. She was wearing dark clothes and sunglasses at 3 a.m. and refused to provide ID. The video showed her ducking and weaving behind cars in the parking lot, as if hiding from something. They found her car 100 miles away from town with a flat tire, her wallet and ID were inside. Dogs followed her trail to the interstate, where they lost the scent. That was the last thing anyone heard about the case for several months. They found a body in a lake nearby that was supposedly identified as her by dental records. They ruled the death an accidental drowning, but the circumstances leading up to it make the whole thing sounded super sketchy. Growing up, one of my family friend's oldest daughter was missing. I was too little to remember meeting her, so all growing up I just heard about my friend's sister. She had always been somewhat troubled and got in with a bad crowd. When she was 16 she just disappeared one day. Her mom kept doing everything she could to find out anything, but there were no leads. No one could find anything on her and because of her age lifestyle, after years of nothing they were afraid she was dead. Then one day out of the blue, after more than 10 years of nothing, they got a phone call that just said, "Mom, it's me." Turns out that she moved across the country with some creep. She eventually got smart and left him, but was too ashamed to call home. When she finally did call home, not only were they overjoyed that their long-lost daughter was alive, but she was also doing incredibly well. She'd gotten her life together, gotten her GED, went to college, had a good job as well as an amazing husband and young son. Since she reunited with her family she has gotten to know her younger siblings. Who were toddlers when she left, and they have gotten to know her husband, and son. She still lives across the country from them, but she continues to do really well, and they've all built a great relationship with one another. My uncle was murdered when I was 6 years old. He was 18, engaged to a girl who lived in Texas, and flying out to see her for Christmas. On his way to the airport a group of men stopped him. He was walking across a parking lot and they shot him execution style. That's what I remember it being called, it was with a gun under his chin. The reason they sought him out was that the leader of the group was the father of a girl who was attracted to my uncle. She claimed he got her pregnant and was leaving, and her dad got his buddies together and killed him. For the record, her story was completely false. He was murdered on Christmas Eve day. My mom opened the door to the cops on Christmas the next morning. I still remember walking up behind her and watching her fall to her knees sobbing. The guy who killed him is still in jail. I think he got life in prison, and about 10 years ago his request for parole was denied. I may be missing details, I was only 6, and while everyone remembered him every year, the details of his death weren't widely discussed after the case was over. I just looked up the case for the first time, some of my details were incorrect and incomplete, and I'll add them below. The father flagged down a cop after killing my uncle, but not before driving home to change and driving to a neighboring state to dispose of his bloody clothing. He claimed to the cop that he was alone and that my uncle had the gun and was shot accidentally during a physical altercation. He claimed my uncle threatened him first and it was self-defense. When they returned to the body, he suddenly remembered another car that drove away after the shots were fired and said maybe they came and took the gun. It was no longer laying next to my uncle where he had supposedly left it. I believe this is why I was told it was a group. The dad was a private detective with knowledge of guns. My uncle was honestly afraid of them and owned none. The girl was most likely pregnant. The lie was in regards to who got her pregnant. She was 16 at the time. And it occurred on Christmas Day, not the night of Christmas Eve. It was the day after Christmas that my mom was the one to answer the door to the cops. I can only blame my poor 6-year-old memory for that mistake. At the end of the day, he got sentenced to life twice over with no chance of parole. It was his attempt to appeal the decision that got turned down. My family has always maintained that the girl was lying. That's been a constant part of the story I was told. It's been over 20 years since this happened, and I have to now admit that what I was told about that might be untrue. It's possible that my family did not want to acknowledge that my uncle was unfaithful to his fiancée. Apparently they probably dated at some point before all of this happened, which I was always told was patently false, and she was just a girl who had a crush on him. Obviously I want to believe that she was lying about the father, but I don't know where my family got that information from, or if it's true. Either way, I don't believe that my uncle deserved to die. Side note, 38 weeks pregnant is a rough time to delve into the worst of my family history. I wish I could reach out to someone I trust to ask questions, but I'm estranged from my mom, and my grandma, great-grandma, and aunt have all passed away. The only person left is my sister, who wasn't even a year old when this occurred, and my brother, who wasn't born yet. Part of me wishes I had never replied to this thread. Part of me is glad to have the additional information. The police received reports that a pickup truck was stunting, driving recklessly, and the occupants were shooting at windows and pedestrians with a pellet gun. They were apprehended, and it turned out the truck they were driving belonged to my uncle, who lived on a farm about 20 miles east of where they were caught. The RCMP went to his farm to see him, but when they arrived my aunt told them he wasn't home. He was at another of his properties about a mile away, helping a woman who was living there. The RCMP went to that property and found him and the woman had both been murdered. Each of them had been shot multiple times. The kids, though 13 years old, who were in possession of his truck, were runaways from a local group home. They were initially charged with mischief and theft, and later they were also charged with the murders. Unfortunately, the only thing tying them to the murders was possession of the truck. As soon as the bodies were found, the kids and their clothes were tested for GSR and blood, but neither were found on either of them. Also, the murder scene was thoroughly examined, and there was no evidence indicating that they'd been anywhere near the victims. With nothing but circumstantial evidence, the murder charges were stayed. The kids served out their sentences for the other charges, and one of them was eventually released. The other ended up having an affair with a female counselor where he was incarcerated. She smuggled in drugs, and he was caught and received additional time. But the other one, the RCMP set up a Mr. Big operation to try and get a confession out of him. Although he did claim responsibility for the murders, including accurately described one of my uncle's gunshot wounds, the court didn't convict him or his partner. I don't think the kids did it. I seriously doubt that a couple teenagers could commit 2 murders, get rid of the murder weapon. It was never found, clean themselves of all forensic evidence, and not leave any behind at the crime scene. But I'm the only person in my family who believes that they're innocent of the murders. Personally, I think the RCMP got fixated on the idea that the kids were involved and didn't bother looking for any other suspects. There still haven't been any other charges in the murders. I felt like adding some details. My uncle, who was killed, my mom's brother, was also my godfather. I think he was about 20 years older than I am. The woman who was killed was, I believe, living rent-free on one of his neighboring properties, and she was about my age. I'm not completely certain, but I think they were having an affair. When the police apprehended the teens in his truck, it was about 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. He had left for her place on Saturday afternoon and hadn't returned home by Sunday morning when the police arrived at my uncle's farm. My aunt told the police that he'd been out all night. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone that long or longer. I met the woman who was killed only a couple of months earlier. As far as I recall, her only source of income was raising and selling, online, rare breeds of chickens. My uncle had called and asked if I could take a look at her computer, since I work in it, and see if I could improve its performance. I met her at her trailer, where the murders took place, and my uncle was there when I showed up. I took her computer home with me, tuned it up as best as I could, and returned it the following weekend. My uncle was there again. Relatively speaking, her computer was an antique that couldn't really be improved. When I returned her computer, I told her that I had numerous computers at home that I wasn't using, and even the worst of them was much newer than hers. I offered to set up one of them with the same or similar software as she was already using, and then let her have it to replace the one she already had. I spent a few hours over the next couple weekends to set up a computer for her, and I was supposed to drop it off the same weekend that they were killed. However, a couple months earlier my fiancée was diagnosed with cancer, and that particular weekend she was in the hospital for a number of tests to determine the number and extent of her tumors, so I called them both and rescheduled for the following weekend. On Sunday, the day their bodies were found, I was returning to the hospital to see my fiancée when I heard about a double homicide on a farm near Ardrossan, the closest town to where my uncle's farm was. The radio report said the victims' names were being withheld until notification of next of kin. My fiancée and I were in her room waiting for test results when I got a phone call from my mom. She started by asking how my fiancé was, and after I told her, she broke down on the phone, telling me that her brother had been killed. The trial for the teen started that summer. My fiancé went into hospital to have a brain tumor removed in September. I married her early in January of the following year. She passed away 2.5 weeks later. Although I suspect my uncle was having an affair with the other murder victim and my aunt probably knew about it, I'm 99.9% certain that she wasn't involved, at least not directly. She has reduced mobility and can only get around with a walker or wheelchair. She tends to animals on the farm by using a golf cart. When I was pretty young. Back in the very early 90s, a friend of my brother's went missing in the middle of their night out. My brother was 17, the friend 19. This is in the UK, not unusual drinking ages for bars. My brother and some friends were at a bar when said friend got up to get more drinks, and he was never seen again. At the time, they thought he'd done an Irish exit, but the next day his parents, and later the police, got in touch with my brother. Apparently his parents heard him come home in the early morning hours, but then heard him leave again for some unknown reason. I remember the police coming to my house and having my brother watch the CCTV footage of him leaving the bar and going to an ATM around the corner and walking off in the opposite direction. Nothing was seen after that. My brother saw him about 2 weeks after that, again on a night out, and he was with some really sketchy looking guys, and he looked pretty strung out. My brother shouted his name, tried to get to him, and the guys made him leave in a hustle. The police thought this was likely mistaken identity, but he's convinced it was him. Some time down the line, body parts, likely chopped up, were found in a nearby canal, but testing at the time indicated they were from someone likely in their 50s. Cut to 2010, and I'm now 22. I'm on jury service at the coroner's court. We're sat in the break room and one of the other jurors is reading the local newspaper. He flips it up and on the front page is an old picture of the missing friend, with the improvements in testing on bones, potentially carbon dating. They retested the parts found way back when and determined that they did belong to my brother's friend. The way that they were cut confirms that he was murdered. I'm glad the family got some closure on whether he was alive or not, but the circumstances are still a mystery. When I was 18 I worked at a local grocery store. I worked in the dairy and would often talk with people in produce and grocery. There was a new guy that started and working in the produce section. Him and a girl from grocery started dating. They dated for around 4 months on and off. She had a kid around 2 to 3 and he was from out of state, so he didn't really have any friends because they started dating really soon after starting. One day she breaks things off with him, supposedly very controlling and verbally abusive. He does not take that very well. A day or so later, on her day off, he went over to her house to pick some things up and talk. She felt uncomfortable with this and called her dad and told him she'd call when he left to let him know she is safe. Her ex was supposed to come over around 2 to 3 p.m. and she wasn't expecting him to stay long. Several hours went by and the dad didn't hear from her. He tried to call several times with no answer, so he drove over to her apartment. He sees her car is still there and goes to knock on the door, but there is no answer. He tries to open it and it's unlocked. When he opens the door and doesn't see anything, her bedroom was first and he went there to check because her purse and phone were still there. When he went to the open door he saw his daughter on the floor in a puddle of blood. She was stabbed to death multiple times in the chest. The news articles don't talk about it, but he also cut her face up pretty bad. The dad freaks out and checks on his granddaughter and she is in her room watching cartoons that the guy put on before he left. If I remember correctly her daughter said something like, "Mom's got ouchies on her face." The dad called 911 and the man was found later on a Greyhound going back to his home state. He admitted to everything. Turns out he brought about 6 knives from the grocery store's produce department with the intention to kill her. Our state has the death penalty, and to avoid it he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Part of the plea bargain was to remove the death sentence and allow a chance for parole. He got 16 to life. I'm still upset. I feel they took the easy way out by offering the plea deal to get the trial over with quickly. I hope he doesn't get out. That might make me a bad person, but from what I've heard from the family and coworkers at the time, was he continued to stab her after she was dead and essentially butchered her face, so it would have to be a closed casket. Like I said earlier, the news never disclosed that part. It's been almost 11 years since her murder. It was crazy because he really seemed like a nice guy at work. I know that is cliche to say, but it's the truth. She was always super nice and friendly, and I'm sure her 13 to 14-year-old daughter misses her. I remember it all being surreal when we found out. My second cousin was a taxi driver. He went out to work on 14th March 2012 and never returned home. Almost the whole town. It's a small town of 300-ish ppl, including the taxi community, went searching for him. Many business shop owners closed their shop down just to search for him. They searched him for days and found nothing. On 19th March, 2 cops patrolling in the next town found a suspicious car that was poorly spray painted with a handwritten plate number on the side of a road. A mini highway with 2 guys beside it. The cops approached them and they immediately sensed something is wrong because the guys was panicking. The cops arrested them and searched the car. Apparently the guy didn't remove the sticker which has the taxi driver details in the compartment box. The 2 guys were arrested and interrogated. From what I heard, the interrogator pulled 7 of the guy nails before he confessed everything. Turns out that 4 guys, including the 2 that was interrogated, pretended to be passengers and tried to rob my second cousin. My second cousin tried to fight back but was strangled to death. They later took the car and drove the body to the beach at the next TOWN about 130 kilometers away and buried the body there. What's sad is that they robbed and murdered my second cousin for only Rm 220. Which is about $80 back in 2012. The 4 murderers were only teens aged between 16 to 19. Another story. My grandfather. My mom's dad, whom I never met, worked in a jewelry shop. One day a guy with a helmet robbed them. I don't really know the exact story, but the robber was extremely nervous and thought my grandfather was trying to run. So he stabbed my grandfather to death. He was arrested few hours later with the help of passerby. Also, one of my best friend's friend were killed in the 2015 Bangkok bombing. Half of his body were blew up and almost unrecognizable. Talk about bad luck. This is an awful story, so get ready. My sister was murdered by her husband on Christmas Eve. He choked her to death, then pretended to be her on her phone and Facebook for the next 2 months. He pretended she had decided raising her 3 kids was too much work and ran away to party and do drugs. The whole family is guilt-ridden because this was all plausible. She'd done it before, but had been doing great for nearly 5 years. Her car turned up at the local docks and sat for a week, so my grandmother took my sister's 11-year-old son to get into their house through the window and see if they could find the keys to move it before it got towed. They'd called the police ahead of time to get permission. Her son found her dead wrapped up in blankets in the closet. Unofficially, the police had known for weeks but couldn't get a warrant. Her husband had also been an informant on a bunch of local drug and theft rings. They caught him early the following morning. He's going on trial for murder in a few months. Now there's a horrific 4-way custody battle over who gets her 3 kids, none of whom involved are good candidates. A friend of mine I'll call Dan up and vanished one spring day in 1997 with his dog and a duffel bag, telling the neighbors he'd be back in a few days. As far as his parents could tell, the only things missing from his room were some t-shirts, a bong, and his spare eyeglasses, so they weren't worried. He'd even left his car and keys. Still, after a week without word, his parents reported him missing. Police, at least according to his mother, were useless, writing the whole thing off as. Young adult decides to go find himself as soon as they found out he'd bought camping supplies and beer the day he disappeared. The police were right. Dan turned up 4 years later, announcing he was alive by walking into the bar his uncle owned with a dog to say hello. Seems he'd gone to an outdoor festival, ran into a guy he went to high school with, and got offered a job doing lighting. After a year of traveling from one show to another, he got a more or less steady gig at an arena in Texas, which led to a side job doing community theater, a wife he met when she auditioned for a Tennessee Williams play, and finally a baby on the way. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please drop a like, and to stay up to date with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button under this video.